Okay, first, a few caveats about my title here, which says tips for capturing flora and fauna in your garden. Number one, there's a whole lot more fauna here than flora, and I realize that this is a native plants group. And so I hope it's okay to mostly have bugs instead of plants, but that's what most of my pictures are, so that's what I end up using for that. The other thing I'm a little unclear about is the garden part, because some of these are from my garden, some of them are from my house, some of them are from the weeds in the backyard, some of them are from California. So hopefully the tips will apply to flora and fauna in your garden, but the pictures aren't all from there. So just a quick overview of what I hope to talk about. First is just, why are you taking pictures in your yard? And by that I mean not, there's a whole bunch of more beautiful places to take pictures than my yard. I could go to the mountains, I could go anywhere. Why do it in my yard? But given that I'm going to be taking pictures in my yard, what are the reasons for doing it? There's a couple of different ones that I'll get into before we get into the details. The second piece is kind of a little geeky section about how your camera sees the world and how that's different from the way your eyes see the world. And hopefully I can get through that without getting too caught up. One other thing, I have to start my timer here, because I timed this at home and it came out about right, but you never know when you start talking. And also feel free to interrupt with questions. There'll be time for questions at the end, but I'm happy to be interrupted along the way too. So the camera doesn't see the world the same way your eye does, and there's some important differences in that. I'll talk briefly about equipment, very briefly about equipment, and then get into some of the more taking pictures side of things, specifically lighting, some tips about sort of how to compose your picture so that your subject draws your eye and looks good. Some things about how you invite the birds and the insects to pose for you, because if you just go wandering the fields, it's hard necessarily to find them in the right position, in the right place where you can get a good picture of them. And finally, I can't avoid a little bit of talking about what happens after you take the picture and processing them in your computer. And again, I won't get into very much at all about that. That could be a huge presentation all by itself, but there's a few things I wanted to mention. So why photograph things in my own yard? For me, the thing that got me started and is still kind of the driving force behind it is to see what's out there. And if I go out there and I see all these strange bugs, I don't have a chance in the world of identifying them. They're there and then they're gone, and I haven't noted the things I needed to note, and I get back and I look in the book and I'm lost. But if I take pictures of them, then I can go back in to my computer. I can blow them up really big and see way more detail than I can see out in the woods on my own or out in the field on my own. I can look on the computer. There's some wonderful insect identification places to go on the computer. There's a great website, bugguide.net, where you can actually submit your pictures and have someone tell you what they are. So pictures make the identification a whole lot easier. And then once you know what they are, you can find out all kinds of cool things about them. So this was one of my favorite discoveries in my yard. I didn't even know that these guys existed. It's something called a wasp-manted fly, which kind of has the body of a wasp, looks kind of like a wasp, has kind of a head like a praying mantis almost. It flies, but it is totally unrelated to flies. It looks like it has lobster claws on the ends of its arms, kind of put together by a committee headed by Dr. Seuss or something. And it has these gorgeous marble multicolored eyes. So it's just a really cool thing to discover that's out there. And since then, I've discovered a couple more species of them. They'll come to lights at night, as well as the first one that I found out in the yard. But they also have a really interesting life cycle. And that's something you can get into. Once you know what something is, you can look it up and you can find out how it lives. And so the female mantis fly will lay its eggs on the underside of a leaf, and they're beautiful little teardroppy things that hang on a thread, and then a little egg on the end of the thread. And the larva will hatch out and hang out on that leaf. And it doesn't really do much of anything. It's waiting on the leaf, just waiting for a spider to come by. And this newborn maggoty little baby insect somehow recognizes a spider when it comes by. It can jump onto the spider and then it rides around on the spider. And it's not really eating the spider. It's not a parasite on the spider, but what it's doing is waiting for the spider to lay eggs. If it accidentally jumped on a male, it's in trouble, and that one probably doesn't make it. But if it's on a female spider and eventually the spider lays eggs, again, this seemingly brainless little thing that's sitting on there recognizes when she's laying eggs, jumps off, climbs into the pile of eggs, and waits for her to finish piling up the eggs and weaving them in a nice cocoon, supposedly to protect the eggs from predators, but in fact, to protect the young mantis fly from predators. And then it's all sealed up safely in that cocoon with an infinite supply of spider eggs to eat. And it munches away until it's ready to pupate and come out and turn into one of these things. So anyway, looking at insects out in the woods, and the same thing can apply to plants. The stories are different, but plants have pretty interesting stories too, in terms of their life cycles and where they come from and what conditions they like and don't like and how they reproduce. But getting into those stories always begins with identification of what's there. So identifying things is one of my biggest reasons for being out there taking pictures. Another thing is just documentation. I have this picture of New England aster. It's not a gorgeous picture of New England aster, but it shows that it's there. It can show me where I planted it, how much of it there was this year. It can tell me what date it was starting to fade in its blooms. So I can have a record through taking pictures of all sorts of things of where I planted things and when they came up and when they faded away and what happened to them. I do a whole lot of macro photography, taking really close-up pictures of things. And I do it partly because I like the way the pictures look, but also it just opens up this whole world that I don't see otherwise. Even if I go around with a hand lens, I don't see the detail that I do when I can get close-up pictures. So in honor of us being the mountain laurel chapter, this is a mountain laurel blossom. You all kind of know how big it really is, but blown up on the screen like this, you see a whole different view of it and little details in it that you don't notice otherwise. Part of it for me is just an excuse to spend some time outside. For some people, weeding the garden works the same way. You can be out there, you have this purpose and reason to be out there, but you pull a few weeds and you get distracted by the bug that's crawling up one of your plants or the bird that perches in the tree or the way the sunlight comes through something and you wander off and do something else. For me, the camera does that. It gives me a reason to be out in the yard and just poke around in things and absorb what's out there. And finally, the cool pictures. And cool pictures is sort of what the presentation is about, but it's kind of number 5 on this list. Not necessarily the least important thing, but only one of several important things. So that's my reasons for being there. This is my geeky section that I sometimes have a hard time getting through when I was practicing at home in terms of being coherent about what I'm saying. But photography is all about light, and the light that comes into the camera is what makes the image. The same thing is true of our eyes. The light comes in through our eyes, but our eyes have really only one way of controlling how much light comes in. There's a pupil in the center of your eye that can close and open. And if you're in the dark room for a long time, it opens wide so you can see in the dark. If you're out in the bright sunlight, it closes down so that you don't get overwhelmed by all the light. And you probably all had the experience of coming out of a dark room into the sunlight and you're kind of blinded by how much light there is. You can't really pick out any detail. And the same thing coming out from the bright snowy field into a dark room and you can't see anything. And the camera has the same problem, actually has the same problem, much worse than we do, but it has 3 different ways of controlling how much light it sees. If it gets too much light, you get a picture that's all white and you can't really see anything in it. If you don't get enough light, it's all black and you don't really see anything in it. The aperture down here is the equivalent of the pupil in our eye. So the lens inside the camera has a little opening that can open and close. And if it's open all the way, then all the light that hits the front of the lens can get into the camera. If it's closed way down, it's kind of blocking a lot of it out so that the sensor of the camera doesn't get overwhelmed by the light. That's true of some cameras. mobile phone cameras usually have a fixed aperture. They don't have something that opens and closes, and some point and shoot cameras don't. So that's off the table for some cameras, but most cameras will have that. The shutter speed is just, our eyes are open all the time seeing the world, but the camera just opens its eye and closes it for a brief flicker, anywhere from 1,000th of a second or less on up to, you can leave it open for long periods of time. And so the number is usually in a fraction, expressed as a fraction of a second. So you might see the number 250 is the shutter speed, but that really means 1/250th of a second. And again, the longer it stays open, the more light comes into the eye. And the third side of the triangle is just the sensitivity of the sensor. So the sensor can take all that light that comes in and use it all, or it can kind of ignore some of it. And that's the ISO number, which ranges from 100 on most cameras is the most sensitive. I'm sorry, the least sensitive it can be, on up to 6,400 or more for if it wants to be real sensitive. So it feels like a little bit of duplication of purpose here. All these three things are doing the same thing. They can let in more light or less light, but they all have side effects. And one of the tricks is to know the side effects and use them as you use them to your advantage. So the thing about shutter speed is if you have a fast shutter speed, it freezes all the motion. Even a race car zooming by or a fly buzzing around, if you got a shutter speed fast enough, you can freeze the motion. At a slower shutter speed, motion or the shake of the camera, my hands are really unsteady, so I can't hold the camera still for long exposures. And so these crocuses, they end up blurry just because my camera's moving or the wind's shaking the crocus or whatever it might be. So you can let in more light with a slower shutter speed, but you're subject to having it blurred. You can use blurring to your advantage, and I recognize this isn't Flora and Fauna anymore, but just sometimes there's a reason to use a slow shutter speed because you want some of that motion to look blurred. Similarly, with depth of field, that's not just, with the aperture, the size of that pupil in your eye, it's not just a matter of the wider the opening, the more light you get, but also it affects the focus of the camera. So with a wide open aperture, you get what's called shallow depth of field. It means the crocuses, or even a few of the petals of the crocuses, are in focus, but the things closer to you are really blurred. The things further back are really blurred. So that narrow depth of field means there's just a little bit of the picture that's in focus. But if you make that aperture smaller, the entire crocus is in focus, plus the background's a lot more visible and the foreground's a lot more visible. And again, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. The blur in this background looks really nice, I think, the way the crocuses kind of hover in there, but I would like the petals of the crocus themselves to be a little more in focus. So you can balance those two things out and choose whatever aperture you want. And finally, the ISO setting, which you would think would be the one that didn't really affect very much else. But as the sensor gets more and more sensitive, the high ISO settings that make it look like there's lots of light, you get what's called noise, just a speckling of the surface, a random difference in things that are really the same color out there, but the sensor picks up sort of random noise in things and you get a speckling. And you can cut some of that out in the computer after the fact, but you generally lose some of the detail and sharpness at the higher ISO settings. So again, you have those three things to play with in terms of controlling how much light comes into the camera. They all have their pluses and minuses one way or another. I tend to do most things by telling my camera to automatically set the ISO to whatever works, and I control the aperture and the shutter speed myself manually. Most cameras have a completely automatic mode that it just will do whatever it thinks is right, or you can control one or the other. And as long as the ISO doesn't go too high, I tend to let the computer and the camera control that. So really quickly, a few things about equipment. The camera with interchangeable lenses is sort of the traditional SLR or the mirrorless cameras that are coming out now. a camera that looks like a camera. And the nice thing about them, one of the nice things about them anyway, is you can put a big telephoto lens on them to take pictures of birds, or you can get a macro lens to take pictures of bugs or anything in between. They tend to have more options and more different things you can do with them. Oops, sorry, I'm not there yet. Moving down to the point and shoot camera, that's more the one you would stuff in your pocket to take with you. A lot of them do have the same kinds of options. A lot of them, you can have a pretty wide zoom range to make up for not being able to put a telephoto lens on. Some of them, you can screw a close-up lens onto the front of them to get closer to things. So they have a lot of possibilities depending on which one you have. They're becoming fewer and fewer of them on the market now because of how much phones have advanced in their photographic capabilities. And I know a lot of pretty serious photographers who are kind of leaving their big cameras at home and doing more and more just with their phone, just because they have it with them and they don't want to lug all that equipment around anymore. The phones in general, their limitations are that little aperture, the little fixed aperture that doesn't let you blur the background. They tend to do less well under bad lighting conditions, but more and more they're actually figuring out how to deal with those things in the software after the fact. So the picture, if you tell it that you want a picture with a blurred background, even though it takes a picture with a sharp background, it can do whatever it does in its computer to make it look like it has a blurred background. Some of those work really well, sometimes they don't. The other thing about newer phones, some of them have more than one lens on them, so they can do a picture through a telephoto lens or through a wide angle lens just because they have different lenses that you can choose from. Some of them you can put little clip-on magnifying glasses basically on them to get really close to things and use them as macro lenses. Clip-on telephoto lenses, clip-on fisheye lenses, and all those things are much cheaper than the same kind of lens for a big camera. So phone photography is something I know very little about, but I hear so much more and more every year about how great phones are getting to be. Okay, changing gears here. What's different about the camera than your eye? There's a couple big things that it does differently. One of the most annoying is the question of dynamic range. And what I mean by dynamic range is the difference between the brightest thing it can see and the darkest thing it can see. So our eyes, I can look out over you and I can see your faces. I can look out the window where it's really bright and I can see the details in the building across the street. I can turn around and look up here or down at my computer where there's an image, and my eye can take that all in. If I take the same picture with my camera, those windows back there are going to be almost completely white. If I expose to where I can see your faces, if I expose to where I can see the picture out the window, then your faces are going to be in the dark. So the camera can't see nearly as much range of brightness as your eye can. And it can do either one of those pictures fine, but doing them both in the same picture doesn't work. The second thing is that your brain, what you actually see is as much a part of what your brain figures out as it is about what your eye actually sees. The camera doesn't have that kind of a brain. It just records what comes in through the front. But I interpret all sorts of things based on what I'm looking out at. If I see something move, I picture it as an animal. We probably all had the experience of looking at rocks and seeing animals in them or faces. It's just the way our minds work. We look for those things. Your eye also has a really high resolution center area. So if I look straight out here, I have a little area that's really well in focus. Everything out to the side is kind of blurred, but my brain can kind of fill in as I move my head around or even move my eyeballs around, it fills in the different things. I have, because I have two eyes, I have depth perception, and I can see the difference in depth between things that are close to me and things that are further away. And that can be really important in trying to make a subject stand out, because if I have somebody sitting in a chair in front of me, I can see that they're close to me. Everyone else fades into the background. With a camera, it all becomes two-dimensional and they don't stand out nearly as much. I've already mentioned kind of your eyes adjusting as you move around. If I look out the window, my pupils will contract a little bit to see the things that are bright. My eyes can change focus from here to the back really quickly. So I see everything in the room in focus because my brain's making that adjustment, and not because my eye necessarily sees it all in focus at once, but it moves and it focuses here and it focuses there, and my brain puts it together into one picture. And finally, your brain is amazing at filling in gaps and removing obstacles. And I don't know if you've done the blind spot experiment where there's a black spot on the paper, and if you look in the right place, the spot completely disappears because it's in your blind spot. But it doesn't just disappear, your brain fills it in with whatever's around it so that you don't even realize that there's a hole there. And similarly, if you look at a beautiful scene that has a log falling down in the middle of it, you can kind of see everything that's around it and you almost don't even notice that's there. But somehow if you take a picture of it, all of a sudden it stands out at you. So a few examples of what I'm talking about: the dynamic range. This is a lizard on a log in bright sunlight. You can see the back of the lizard. You pretty much don't see any color in because it's all overexposed. It's got too much light. It kind of gets washed out as white. The belly of the lizard, you don't see much of any color in because it's too dark. And so as my eye viewing this lizard would have seen a gorgeous lizard with speckled back, and I would have seen some of the detail in its stomach, but the camera can't take it in all at once because some of it's too bright and some of it's too dark. Similarly, this swallow on a bird box. In the first picture, I've kind of exposed for the swallow and gotten him to show some of those shimmering feathers, but the wood of the bird box is pretty much bleached out white. In the second picture, I've done the opposite. I've tried to make the bird box look a little more natural, but the swallow ends up completely dark. And there are some manipulations you can do in the computer to try and help those things out. Now I just want to do a little experiment with you that I'm going to put some pictures up on the screen. And the idea is to kind of look at them as though that's just flashing up there and think about, where does your eye go? What do you notice first? So this one is a flicker in that same juniper tree that the cedar waxwing was in. If I were looking at that scene with my eye, that flicker wouldn't be standing still. I would immediately see it just because it moves. If it were sitting still, I probably wouldn't, but my human eye sees that motion and zooms in on it. Here, I zoomed in on it right away too, because it had that sparkly eye. So I didn't have any trouble with my eye going to that to begin with, but once I see it, then I start noticing all this stuff around it, and the background gets to be too busy, and my eye can't really stay settled in on the bird the way I would like it to. I've got 3 different pictures here of this seaside field of California poppies from when we went out to California last spring. So this one, when I look at this one, the first thing my eye sees is the person on the trail in the upper left. And I think that's kind of a human thing. We notice faces, we notice people. And once I see the person there, then I see all the flowers. But the first thing I saw was the person. I don't know, that may not be the same for everybody, but that's where my eye went. A just slightly different view. I put the ocean and the sky in, and now partly the person is a little smaller. There's actually 2 people in this picture, but my eye goes to that bright space in the upper left, which isn't really what the picture's about at all. And partly it's nice being out there and you feel the ocean and the breeze, and the ocean is part of the experience. But in this picture, the ocean isn't interesting. It's just plain flat, out of focus water and sky. But because it's bright, it draws my eye away from the part of the picture that I really want to look at. And this one is kind of the same thing, but now the ocean has become interesting. And I think because the ocean is a bigger part of the picture. It doesn't suck your eye up into the upper left the way it did in the other picture. Flowers stand out a lot more, partly because they're closer to the camera and they've got some texture in them, the mounds, instead of just a massive orange. So 3 different compositions. I wouldn't say necessarily one is more successful than the other. They're different, except I don't like the middle one. But they bring out different things as you look at them. That first one is kind of the experience of being in the middle of that field of flowers and just flowers everywhere. This one shows more the shapes of the flowers and gives you more of a feeling of the ocean. Okay, a little bit about lighting. There's a couple different sort of comparisons of light that I want to do. One is hard light versus soft light. This is the same lizard that we looked at before. And the reason he has this problem with the dynamic range, with the brightness and the darkness, is because the light is really hard. And what hard light means is it comes from a single source. So this is the sunlight shining on him from this one little ball of fire up in the sky. It lights up one side of them really well, but there's no light hitting the other side. Makes really dark, sharp edge shadows. It shows the texture really well, the texture of the scales, because it makes those shadows around each scale. So it does really well at showing textures, but it tends not to show colors well, just because the brightly lit parts are really bright, the darkly lit parts are really dark. So in pictures of flowers, for instance, where you really wanted to show the color of the garden or the color of the flowers, that hard, bright sunlight tends not to work nearly as well. A softer light on this California quail, you don't see those shadows at all. This is kind of a hazy, overcast day, late in the day. And as a result, all parts of the bird and the background and the fence and everything are kind of lit much more evenly. It brings out the colors a lot more. It brings out the texture less because you don't have those shadows that emphasize edges. So that's soft light versus hard light. The other thing is the color of the light. Warm light is light that tends to have redness in it. So at sunset and sunrise, photographers refer to that hour before sunset and the hour after sunrise as the golden hours, because the light has that golden warm quality to them. So this fox, you can actually see if you look at the shadows, but it's still kind of hard light. It's got pretty distinct shadows behind its paws there. But because the sun's getting low in the sky, it's a little more diffuse. It's not nearly, doesn't have the harshness that it did on that lizard, and partly that's the warmth. A cooler light. This is a rainy day, some fading daffodils. Well, I think of that as my wife and I walking down, kind of having a hard time, the sore joints in the rain. But rainy weather, shade on sunny days tends to be a bluer color, and it just gives a different feel to the light when it's got that cool color to it. The other thing is the direction that the light's coming from, and this one I'll confess isn't in my garden, it's in the zoo, but still. This one, the light's coming from behind her and lights up sort of the rim really well. Because it's bright light shining on the back, if I were worried about sort of the exact exposure, the halo of fur around the top and back is overexposed. The front of the gorilla is underexposed, but the effect, as long as you can get enough detail in that face to be able to see it, the effect can be really nice. But the exposure can be a challenge because the light's coming from behind and not lighting up the face very well. The ideal situation would be the light, if the light were coming from behind, but there would be some kind of a wall to reflect some of it back and light up the face. This is a similar situation, a white-throated sparrow outside my living room window with the sun lighting it up from behind, but I filled in the front of it this time with a flash. So we can see the detail in the front the way we couldn't with the gorilla, but the halo isn't as pronounced because I've sort of overwhelmed it with the flash a little bit. Light coming from the side, if it's harsh light, kind of gives you this appearance of half the hatch is there and half of it isn't almost. So it can look very harsh if it's hard light. A softer light from the side can really emphasize the three-dimensionality of something, kind of like if you picture a picture of a ball or the something round with one side better lit than the other, and kind of the transition across the front. Side light can also emphasize texture really well, like the veins in the butterfly's wing, because it's lighting it up just from the edge, and it lights up the things that stick out and the things that don't go into the shade. Once the light moves around to the front, the same red-breasted nuthatch, it's still not quite the front, there's some shade under his belly, but the texture starts to wash out more because the light's getting into all parts of them. But the colors are more even. You can see the colors better because there isn't that dark part that you're trying to get lit. And another more extreme front light, because this one's from the flash, so it's right there where the camera is. And it almost makes it two-dimensional because everything's lit well. There isn't that shadow around the front that gives you the three-dimensionality. So that's lighting, and it's not something that you necessarily have control over. If you're going out in your garden to take a picture, the light is what it is, but you can take control of it by just choosing when to be out there. If you want rich, colorful pictures of flowers, go out there on a hazy day and not a bright, sunshiny day, things like that. So I wanted to talk about the background a little bit. And my pictures, I was thinking about this as I did this slide, that in a lot of pictures, you might be taking a picture of a scene in your garden, and there isn't necessarily a foreground and a background. There isn't necessarily a subject. And it seems like everything I'm saying is more of a portrait sort of thing. I'm taking a picture of this bug or of this bird, and I want that to stand out, and I want the background to kind of fade away. That isn't always true. One thing someone said at a photography workshop I went to one time is that you have to have a vision for your picture. You have to have this idea of what you want it to look like, and then think about how to bring that out. And then what he said was, wow, isn't a vision. And that really hit me, because for me, wow is often all I think about. Wow, that's cool, click, click, click. But not thinking beyond that to, what really is the subject of this picture. If you're taking a picture of your garden as a whole and looking at how it lays out, then you want to think about, how do I show the paths and the shapes? If I'm taking a picture of this flower and I want to show what it looks like, then that's the subject I want to think about, how to make that stand out. So in my world, almost always what I'm trying to take a picture of is something specific in a setting, but there is a clear subject. And so a lot of this applies to that situation, but that isn't always what you want. So avoiding clutter. This is that same old tree in our backyard, cedar waxwing time. There's a really bumper crop this year, and it's really cool seeing all those birds there, but you kind of lose them in the background. It gives you a feeling of the place where they are, but you can't see them individually. Pick out one of them and remove the clutter from the background by having it out on the branch on the side of the tree, and there's bright sunlight on the tree that the bird's in, but a shaded area behind. That's where that dynamic range that the camera can't see comes to your advantage, because that area behind the bird wasn't really that black. It wasn't nighttime, but because the camera can't see that difference in brightness, it kind of fades away into darkness. This one, it's sort of, I took the background away completely by lighting up the flower. This is a pyrola flower. I love the pairs of pants that make the stamens. They just, it looks like a bunch of women diving into a pool from all the edges or something. Again, I use a flash a lot of times for macro photography, and that lights up the thing that's really close to the camera, but doesn't light up the background very well. So you end up with pictures that look like night, but it also really makes the subject stand out. Another picture where the light is kind of what makes it stand out, but the other way around. And this one wasn't really intended to be a picture of this tree in particular. It's a picture of the misty morning and the colorful autumn leaves. But that shape of that tree is kind of what makes the picture. It's just something to put in there to give your eye something to focus on. But the reason it stands out from the trees in the background that are really more red maple trees of a slightly different color is just that it's darker. It doesn't have the mist between it and me that the further away trees do. So one way to kind of bring that subject up to the front is by having it be either much brighter or much darker than the things behind it, and that lets your eye pick it out. Another one, this stink bug is almost the same color as the background, the mottled greens and yellows, but it stands out because it's in focus and the background isn't. So that's where that aperture comes in. If this were a really narrow aperture, a high f-stop, then the background would be in focus and you wouldn't see the bug as much. But because the aperture is more open, the background goes out of focus. Similarly with this wren, the background is kind of gone just because it's out of focus. There really are branches and sticks and all kinds of stuff back there, but it's far enough back that it's not in focus. Sometimes the background's important though, and these rhododendron bushes in the Alps, azaleas of some sort, they're pretty in their own right, but the only reason that's an interesting picture is because of the background. If the background had been perfectly sharp and in focus, I think it would be harder to see the flowers because they stand out by their color. But by having it kind of out of focus, it lets you clearly see what's the subject of the picture, the flowers, but it gives you a sense of the setting, it gives you the sense of the wide open valley and the snowy and rocky mountains, lets you know where you are without distracting too much from the flowers themselves. Another way to make the subject stand out is just with color. So this is desert wildflowers in California, and just it was a really good flower year, and the whole ground was covered with these white popcorn flowers, I think they're called. And the sand verbena, if this were a black and white picture, it would all just blend in together, but they pop out just because of the difference in color. These are ambush bugs. Just bizarre looking creatures, kind of prehistoric. And it's, I thought this was going to be a really great picture. It's sort of a classic setting, like the bighorn sheep butting heads fighting over the females. And in this case, the female is the one down at the bottom, and the one on the left is actually mating with her, and the other one's trying to push him away. And I watched them for 20 or 30 minutes, and they went at it like this, pushing and shoving, and then the other one would go wander around on the flower for a while and get himself worked up again. And then he'd come back and push and shove some more. And so I was really pleased with this, but when I look at it, I can't really see them because the background is too much the same color. It's got those, the yellow balls of, I guess the pistils of the flower. They look just like the eyes of the bugs. So I don't do this kind of stuff very much. I did it for this presentation just to make the point that if I had been able to fade out that background by using a bigger aperture, all of a sudden you can see the insects a lot better. So I did that in the computer after the fact. It wasn't a different picture. And I'm not sure that I actually could have done it with the camera, because in order to get all three of them in focus, I couldn't have the wide open aperture that would have made the background out of focus. This you would think had the same issue. It's got a very cluttered background of Joe Pye weed, but the yellow colored skate moth stands out because of the color is such a contrast. So again, it's the question of, do you want to leave that, have that background there to give the feeling of what that head of Joe Pye weed looks like with all its fingers sticking up there. And I kind of like that. But in this case, you know, if I'd had a pink bug on there, it kind of would have got lost, but because this one's a different color, it can stand out. Another little background distraction that's just a random thing. This is a purple sandpiper, and I love the position. It looks like I feel like when I'm going down a steep slope of carefully putting one foot and not being quite sure if it's going to slip or not. But this little spot right at the tip of his beak is just a random reflection off the water, but distracts so much from the picture when I look at it that it almost ruins the picture, even though most parts of the picture I really like. And I've tried to erase it with the computer, but I can never make it look good. So one of the takeaways from that is always to take lots of pictures. If you have something exciting like that, just hold the shutter button down and let it go click, 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 and the little waves will move. And if you have the bird blinking its eye in there once, you'll get some other pictures where it isn't blinking its eye. So just giving yourself a few to choose from can remove some of those random distractions. One other composition piece that I don't think about very much, but I read about, is what's called leading lines. That in this picture, it's just Charlotte walking down a trail past an oak tree. But all the lines in the picture kind of lead towards the center of the branches of the tree leading down here, the trail curving down here. And that all kind of lets your eye focus on that one. And when you look at a picture, sometimes your eye kind of rests in one place and you just look there. And to me, this one does that, so that that center focus area of my eye rests on her and the base of the tree. And the other part is just environment. It feeds into that, but it's not a distraction. In other pictures, my eye roams from one place to another, seeing all the different parts of it. So it's another leading lines picture, which is I forget the name of the mushroom. It's a yellowish fungus that doesn't actually have a stem. It's more of a shelf fungus. But anyway, what I like about it is this cave down in the middle of it with a nice mossy floor. It's, I think, the fungal mycelium. And then the lines of the gills of the mushroom kind of lead you around to that, so that it's got all this color around it, but there's no question about what the center of the picture is. Another thing that I'm not quite sure what to make of is that your eye in a picture is used to reading books, and text goes from left to right, and your eye naturally scans a picture from left to right. And if I were to talk to somebody who is really into this composition business that I don't entirely understand, they would say your eye moves into this picture from the left. It's clearly attracted to these rocks that are the center of the picture, but these lines here lead you out to the right. So if you look at this picture, you see the rocks to begin with, but your eye is drawn out of the picture, and that would be considered negative. I'm not sure it's negative to me, because I picture the water doing that. It goes in from the left and it goes down to the right, and that's kind of the way it ought to be. But I do see that if I turn the picture around the other way, I react to it very differently. That in this one, my eyes follow those leading lines to the rock and they get stuck on the rock. And a lot of people would say that's good. You want them to focus you on that rock, but somehow that fights with me against the water going the other way. And I'm not sure, I think I like the other one better, even though this is the one the photographers would tell me the way it's supposed to be. And I do see, even though I don't quite buy the whole thing, I do see that in this one, my eyes lock onto those rocks. And in this one, my eyes see the rocks and then pass on out to the right. Another thing to think about is anytime you have something with direction in it, a bird flying like this, or it could be just a bird sitting on a branch and looking one direction, or it could even be that tree in the misty morning picture that's leaning one direction. You always want it to be flying into the picture, or leaning into the picture, or looking into the picture, and not looking out the other way. So if I put this way, it's not nearly as satisfying as this way. And I'm not entirely sure why. It feels like the bird needs some space to fly into. It feels like it's about to leave if it's like that. So these are just crops off of the same picture, which is this picture, and I like it better with this bird smaller. Usually I'm trying to zoom in on the bird and get them as big as possible. But it needs to be over on that side of the picture so it has some room to fly into. The same with this red start, maybe, I've forgotten what it is, some kind of little warbler in the spring. So the bird's body is facing towards me, but because the head is turned the other way, it really needs to be on this side of the picture so it has something to look at instead of just looking out the wall of the picture. There's another composition rule that's another good one to break as much as it is to use, but sometimes it's sensible, is kind of the rule of thirds, that when you have a main subject, You don't want it in the middle of the picture. You want it to be about a third of the way from one edge or from the top or the bottom. The same with this one. It's kind of a third of the way from the bottom, partly to leave room for its antenna. It's got these leading lines that lead you in towards its head. Its face is kind of the only thing in focus in the whole picture, so that your eye has nowhere else to look besides into those eyes. Okay. Birds don't really like to pose for you. You don't often run into them just wandering around in a position close enough to take good pictures. Insects, the same deal. They're less shy than the birds are in general, but flowers will bring them in and lights will bring them in sometimes. So what I like to do with birds is we've got old double hung windows in our house, and I can set up my camera where I'm down on the floor and it's kind of on windowsill level, about that far off the floor. And then I pull down the upper sash, pull down the blinds, stuff my coat in around the camera, so it's pretty well hidden. And I can set up stumps and branches and things for the birds to perch on, only 5 or 6 feet from the wall, and the birds are happy to come. And then I can put some mealworms down under them. Bluebirds love mealworms. I'm amazed how they can find freeze-dried mealworms within hours, even when you hadn't seen bluebirds around in weeks, but you put them out and they're there instantly. But because I'm really close, and they don't know I'm there, they'll pose, they'll be pretty relaxed, and I can take pictures of them. So this male bluebird on the very same stick, you'll notice I have one little posing place for them. It's nice not to have too many things around because that gives the birds too many choices. But if you can give them one thing that's kind of where they have to come as they're zooming in on their food, then you're ready for them. That's the other thing, is that they have too many places and you're looking through your telephoto lens, they perch over there, you may not even notice that they're there. So blue jay on the very same branch stump, I'm not quite sure what it was. Can also do the same thing on the upper side of the double hung window, and then you can have a post there for the woodpeckers with a suet feeder on, and a lot of times they'll land above the suet feeder and work their way down, or land below it and work their way up. But it's nice to be on their level. So for the guys on here, I'm down at the bottom of the window, but for the woodpeckers and things, I'd be at the upper, and it's just a nice way to spend, especially a cold winter day. You're in there about 3 feet from the wood stove, looking out the window, and the birds are out there in the snow. Insects, the biggest thing to attract them is flowers. Bees, moths, flies, butterflies, all sorts of different things will come to flowers. And there's particular flowers that particular ones are attracted to. These are Charlotte's Mountain Mints, and a great golden digger wasp is the name of this wasp. It's a glorious wasp with a glorious name. It's pretty big, 1.5 inches long or something. It comes zooming in with this loud, makes you want to turn tail and run. And it moves really quickly, but it seems to be pretty unaggressive. It's never paid me any attention. And once it starts bumbling around from one flower to another, you can kind of work your way in, and you don't get a great picture every time, obviously. I don't know how many pictures of them I have, quite a few. This is another mountain mint resident that comes in for a week or two every summer. I've gotten to know them just because they're so predictable. They're hard to take pictures of because they're pretty small, and they always are hunched over like this guy is. Got to be down below them kind of to look at them, but I love their antenna. Only the males have those antenna, but I think of them as like, you always have a herd of them on these flower heads. They congregate, but they remind me of the elk, with the herd of elk and the males there and all the females gathered together in the same place.
What is that one?
He's called a wedge-shaped beetle.
Wedge shaped?
Yeah, which is, I think, a whole family of beetles, but it doesn't have any more specific name than that. This is the cousin of the great golden digger wasp. I think it might just be called the great wasp or the great black digger wasp or something like that. Not as colorful, but still a handsome creature. Black insects are challenging just because it's really hard to see the detail in them. And a hair streaked butterfly, again on the mountain mint. So the nice thing about that, if I'm going out in the meadow searching for insects, number one, they're hard to find. But number two, you're always getting down on your knees and getting back up and getting back down and getting back up. But if I plant myself in front of these flowers, I can kind of be in one place. I can even bring a chair and hang out there, and I might have to get up because there's something over on that flower that I want to see. But it can be a much more comfortable way to spend time with them than wandering the field. I should mention on this one, just because I talked about it earlier, you can kind of see that there's the side light coming from this side. It lights up the head while the tail's in the shade. So you can tell the light's coming from this direction, but because it's from the side, it brings out the texture in the wings really nicely. You can see all the little ripple marks in there. The other way to bring in insects is with lights, and moths, of course, are the classic ones that you see when you put lights out. I like to hang a sheet on a clothesline, and then I put a drop light out there underneath it to shine on the sheet, and they'll come in to the sheet. If you're taking pictures just for identification and you want to know how many moths you have in your yard, which is kind of what got me started on this whole thing, the answer so far, I think, is 400 something different species of moths, which is kind of incredible. Just how much variety there is and how often there's something you haven't seen before. But they don't end up being very great pictures from the point of view of looking at them and saying, wow, that's nice. If this background is a white sheet. So a lot of moths will let you actually pick them up and move them to somewhere else, especially the heavy bodied ones like this. They don't particularly like to fly, and if you kind of put your finger or a stick under their front legs, they'll kind of climb onto it, and you can go take them and put them down somewhere else. Some other insects won't let you do that, and some moths won't. But especially if it's cold out, one thing I like to do is put the sheet out at the night, in the evening, come back the next morning at first light, and then the weather's cooled down, the moths are slower, and it's easier to get them to sit where you want them to sit. The downside of that is if you don't get up early in the morning, the phoebes will find the sheet before you do, and you'll go out there and you'll find them picking the moths one by one off the sheet. The other thing I do with some insects is actually to pick them off the sheet and put them in a little jar and put them in the fridge, and then bring them out later when they're cold, and they'll often sit still better. This one is a tent caterpillar moth. We're all pretty familiar with the tent caterpillars themselves. The moths are actually kind of pretty. And a rosy maple moth, I just really like the face and the bushy pink and yellow eyebrows, and I think of the antenna as kind of droopy retriever ears or something. Water is another good thing for both birds and insects. We don't have a good pond at our yard, but I enjoy going and sitting by the shore of Mansfield Hollow Lake at a place where there's a lot of dragonflies in the summer, and you watch them and you get to know their favorite perches, and can spend a great couple of hours just trying to get pictures of them as they fly by and land. This one's laying eggs in the pondweed. Another example of where it would be nice if the background had been more out of focus and you could see the insect better. All right, this is getting to the computer part of it. And the biggest thing about doing things in the computer for me is keeping your options open. If you're taking a picture of a flower or a garden, you have lots of time to kind of set up your camera and get things set up exactly the way you want. With birds and insects, everything happens fast, and you just have to take pictures and hope. And ways that you can sort of make that hope more likely to come true. One is, instead of taking a picture of that moth's face from really up close, take a picture that gives you a little more room around it. And that way, if the moth moves, or if you discover something that isn't quite the way you thought it was, it gives you gives you more flexibility. And then once it's in the computer later, you can crop it. Underexposing, if you make the pictures come out a little bit darker than what you'd really like them to be, it gives you more flexibility in fixing things up. Blown, if the highlights are too bright, it's something you can't really do anything about. They're stuck that way. But if you have shadow that's too dark, you're more likely to bring it up and more likely to be able to bring it up and bring out the color and make it look right. So I always, rather than trying to expose perfectly, I make the pictures a little darker than they should be. Raw files are something that can be kind of inconvenient if you want to take pictures and share them on Instagram right away, or email them to somebody or use them as is. They don't work. But when you take a picture with your camera or your phone and you ask it to give you a JPEG that's ready, the camera's made a lot of decisions for you along the way, because it takes all this information into its sensor and it decides how bright you want the picture to be. It decides how much you want to bring up the shadows to be able to see what's in them. It decides how bright you want the colors to be, how saturated. It makes all those decisions for you. And sometimes it does a pretty good job. In fact, most of the time it does a pretty good job. But the original information in the file that the camera collects, there's a lot more information in there than what you get in a JPEG file. So if you're willing to spend the time on the computer or on your phone can do these things too. It's basically just a little computer. If you get the camera to give you raw files, it lets you fix things up after the fact. So one example of it, back to our magic fly that we started out with, this is what it would come directly out of the camera. It's a little bit darker and framed with lots of extra space around it because I didn't get as close as I might have liked to get close. But the reason for that is it lets me mess around with it later. So I can brighten it up really easily. And these are all adjustments that you don't need any special software for. This isn't doing Photoshop. This is, if you're in Windows, there's a photo app in there that lets you adjust all these things and crop. Your phone will do the same thing. Macintosh will do the same thing. It's all there in the operating system and doesn't take any special software. So I can brighten it up a little bit. I still don't like that big black part down at the bottom, so I can crop in a little bit closer, but then it starts to look like he's crawling out the bottom of the frame. What I was saying about they need some space to move into. So I crop it again and tilt it up a little bit. I like it better this way. I've lost the tips of the wings, but I couldn't tilt it without cutting them out just because I hadn't given myself enough room in the back. So I move in a little closer, get that head up into the upper part of the frame. This isn't what I was visualizing at all when I took the picture, but I like it better than what I started with. And that's sort of what I'm talking about, of giving yourself options. I am not good at sort of seeing what's going to happen when I take the picture. And I always find when I get them into the computer that there's things that there's ways I can change them so that I like them better. I can zoom in even further, and now it starts to feel like it's too close. I'm losing some of the detail because I've cropped out almost the entire picture, and there isn't quite that much resolution there. The big problem with this picture that I can't do anything with is all the reflections from the flash, the glare off of different parts, and that comes out more when you get in closer. So I back off, and I think this is what I like best. So I think it's just important to recognize that what you see in the viewfinder isn't necessarily what's going to be the nicest picture in the end. And if you can keep your options open by using raw files, by shooting a bigger picture than what you really want, and by underexposing a little bit, it gives you more choices when you come along at the end. So just a few more examples. I mostly put this in because I wasn't sure how long it was going to take and whether I was going to have extra time at the end. So these are mostly for fun, but this is a tree hopper nymph being tended by an ant. And the reason I put that in there, this isn't something I could ever get by attracting insects with lights or with flowers. it's a matter of going out and seeing what you discover. So I talk about those attracting them to pose for you, but there's a lot that you can find just by wandering around and looking closely too. The other thing about this, it's taken with a flash. It looks unnatural kind of for the bottom of the leaf to be lit up as much as the top of the leaf. And that's just a lighting thing to think about. If I had done it knowing what I was doing, I think I would have want the top lit better than the bottom, make it look more natural. I love this little jumping spider. Again, it's a matter of he's not going to come to my flowers or my lights, but if I wander the goldenrod patch in the fall when it's starting to wilt, there were actually quite a few of them that year that made these little nests in there. Mushrooms that I discovered in my wood pile. A lot of serendipitous discoveries out there if you keep your eyes open and don't have preconceived notions of what you're going out there looking for. These are hickory tussock moth larvae, and the hickory tussock moth is one of the most common caterpillars you see late in the year with this beautiful long white hair and black tufts. But when they're young, they gather together like this in a mass, and apparently this fools birds. To me, when I walked by this hickory tree, this leaf stood out like a sore thumb because it had all this stuff on it. But for a bird, it doesn't register as caterpillars when they're all massed together like that. So the bird will move on by. Butterfly weed seeds in the seed pod. This is a predatory stink bug eating a caterpillar. And he's one that I found in the sweet fern patch. And it was such a tangle of weeds and branches that I couldn't get anywhere near it to take a picture, but I was able to coax him onto that stick and kind of bring him out to where I could see him. So mushrooms, I'm kind of out of time here, so I'm just going to zoom through these last few. One thing to think about is you get a picture and there's sort of the classic picture of this cluster of mushrooms, but can you find a different angle to look at it from? And I kind of like this getting closer. My go-to always seems to be getting closer to things because I really love doing the macro photography. The buds from the butterfly weed, they almost have more character than the flowers. The flowers are great for attracting butterflies and they're a gorgeous splash, but looking up close, I just love all the little textures and shapes in this. This one was a mushroom. I found a log in the woods that was covered with mushrooms and just had lots of twisted shapes from drying out. And I spent quite a bit of time with it out there, but it was really uncomfortable and the ground was wet and they were all really low down. So finally I just grabbed a piece of bark and took it home and did the photography in my kitchen in comfort. Big blue stem flowers. Again, what you see differently when you get up close. This, I don't know if you see it immediately, but it's actually a picture of a caterpillar and not a leaf. And I like it just because it's such an incredible mimic of the dead patches on the leaf. And a newly hatched cicada pretending he's not there. You can't see me. But he was actually quite cooperative and was able to pose for me for a head-on picture too. And then finally, this tiger swallowtail caterpillar who you think those are its eyes, but really its head is buried down underneath here. And there are two big eye spots on its thorax that are meant to convince prowling birds that it's really a snake. And that's the end. Thank you, guys. I'm happy to take any questions. Nobody interrupted me along the way. Yeah, super.
What kind of camera do you shoot with?
I have a Canon SLR with full frame sensor. I have a bit of a equipment habit that's probably excessive, but I can't resist new gizmos.
And telephoto lens is what you use the most?
For most of these pictures, it's a macro lens. So I sort of have three lenses that I use a lot. I have a telephoto lens that I use for birds and butterflies mostly. It's a It's a 100 to 400 millimeter zoom. And I have a sort of all-purpose lens. I think it's 24 to 70 millimeter. And then I've got a macro lens for the close-up work.
How do you store, organize, and name your photos?
Don't let Charlotte get to talking to you about labeling my pictures. Not well enough. I label them when I download them with a general category like old insects or Mansfield hollow birds or something like that. With the insects and the birds, I'm pretty good at labeling them in their file names with species information. But I don't do as good a job as I would like to, and that makes it hard to dredge up a picture that I knew I took somewhere I can't quite find. They're all filed by date. But
And you
it's
just throw them
definitely-
on your computer?
I just
or
throw
do
them
you
in
use
folders on my computer. I don't use a cataloging program, and I thought I ought to and gotten started on it once or twice, but
the same
it's
place for
too
you. I've been looking for-
overwhelming to go back into the old ones and try and dig through them.
Yeah.
And I'm not as good as I would like to be at throwing out pictures that aren't quite what I wanted them to be, so I have way more pictures.
How many pictures are we talking about? It must have very many.
A number of pictures.
That's probably file size.
Yeah. A random guess, I'd say there's 10,000 of them sitting on my computer, but I don't really have any idea. Yeah,
So how much storage does that mean you are using? I mean, I'm already out of storage taking pictures and I'm not even really at the tires.
yeah, I don't have them on this computer. I have the ones that I'm working on currently on my computer. And then I download them or upload them or move them, I'm not quite sure what the word is, to various external hard drives. So yeah, the file sizes are big and they add up quickly. Yeah,
When you enter a photo contest, which I do often,
mhm.
do the judges look for certain things like the 1/3, your picture taken up? Do they ever consider just the picture, it seems like they pick the oddest pictures to win.
Yeah, I have wondered what goes into their judging. I've been to exhibits and the ones that they've chosen for prizes are not the ones that I would have chosen. And I've talked to a few judges about what they liked and what they didn't like. One thing that they've all said is they're always overwhelmed by how many pictures there are. And so they do a first look through of just ones that strike them in some way as being exciting. And then they scan those for the technical perfection. If there's anything they can point to that's wrong with it, that gives them an excuse to toss something out. They think about those things like the rule of thirds and about leading lines. And a lot of times I think if they're looking for something to distinguish pictures, they'll notice that this does that or doesn't do it. But my impression is that they're all always pretty hard pressed to decide one way or the other. And that first cut comes from just the initial impression, which is the whole picture. Couple of them have said that having something that jumps out at you, high contrast, bright colors or something that will make it stand out at first, that subtle pictures don't always do as well in a contest because they're not the ones that jump out in that first scan of all 1,000 or however many pictures they have to look at. They might, if they got that closer look, they might be outstanding, but they don't get the closer look because they don't strike you in that first 3-second glimpse before they move on to the next picture. So I don't know, it's a mystery to me.
Sometimes you get lucky and.
Yeah, and I can say the same things for when I get lucky that my picture isn't necessarily what I would have chosen. It's not a matter, I like mine better than other people's. It's just. If I were choosing, there's certain ones that stand out to me, way too many of them that stand out to me, and I wouldn't be able to choose my first choices either. But different people have different things they're looking for, I think.
Right.
And that's another thing I've heard is different judges will choose completely different things.
A comment more than a question, because I was interested at the beginning of your presentation. You said you apologized about using the words garden, yard interchangeably, and it made me realize that the more we go down this road of environmental stewardship, the more the lines are blurred between garden, yard, the greater community, the
Yeah,
trails we're on, the places we visit when we travel. It all falls under our care and responsibility and kind of our consciousness, but thank you for
I
that.
like
'cause
that.
Yeah,
You mentioned using the flash
Mhm.
for micro photography.
Yeah,
Why do you do that? Can you?
there's a couple reasons. Mostly it's easier. I don't like the results. Sometimes you get reflections, and some of my favorite macro pictures that I've taken are without flash. But the percentage of pictures that comes out respectively using flash is so much higher. And that's partly when you're doing insects especially, but flowers too, there tends to be this hodgepodge of branches and twigs that are blocking the light. And so unless you've got really soft light coming from all directions, there's going to be shadows on top of things. But if you're controlling it with your flash, then everything ends up lighted reasonably well. So it makes a lot more pictures accessible to me because I don't have to worry about the light. The other thing with insects is they tend to be moving around quickly, things happen quickly. And having the flash gives me one fewer things to think very much about as I'm doing it. I mentioned my hands tend to be kind of unsteady, and the flash lets me keep, it's an instantaneous flash, so it removes the camera shake or the fluttering bug movement from the equation. There's macro flashes which let you play with the direction of light. The one I have has two flash heads and it mounts on the front of the camera. And so if I want the light to be coming from this side, I can make that one be really bright and that one be really dim, or I can move them up next to each other. So there's a certain amount of flexibility that you have with the lighting. If I wanted the light on that, think back to the hair streak butterfly. The light was coming from the side very nicely and it lit up its head, and it lit up the wing really well. If the butterfly had been turned a little bit different way, then the back of the wing would have been in the dark. If it had been turned a little bit the other way, then it would have been a more direct light and not showing the ripple marks. So that same butterfly I got lucky with because it was pointed just the right direction. I like that picture better than another one I took of the same butterfly in the same place with the flash. But I can get the picture 9 times out of 10 with the flash and 1 time out of 50 without the flash.
When you recommended going out into the field and positioning yourself near a particularly attractive flower or bring a chair, do you use a tripod then, or do you?
I don't. The only time I use a tripod is for the birds because I'm kind of set up and I know where I'm looking at, or if I'm doing macro, if it's at my kitchen table and I have something in really controlled conditions. But in general, the insects are moving around too much. And if I position a tripod, by the time I'm ready to take a picture, the insect is somewhere else. So I've just found it's too cumbersome. Yeah.
Yes, have you ever played around with black and white at all? Given this is nature, is color just going?
I have some, I don't do it a lot. The things that I like black and white for are where the the forms and the shapes are really stunning. For most of the insects and flowers, I haven't been drawn that direction. Occasionally I see a picture where I think, oh, let's try that in black and white, and I'll give it a go. And the nice thing about the modern world of doing it in the computer is you don't have to know which you're doing when you take the picture. You can make it black and white after the fact. And there's a few pictures I've done with that I like, but it's not really part of my general repertoire. Yeah.
What are you using for editing? Are you using, it's in the computer or are you using editing program?
I use mainly the program that Canon gives you with their cameras for converting raw files. And that will do all the color corrections and cropping and things that I want it to do. It's called digital DPP, digital photography, something or other. And it just comes with a camera. I've got various other oddball programs for doing specific things. I don't use Photoshop, not on any principle or, but way back when I started doing this, I got this freeware program that kind of was an imitation, and I stuck with that for a while, but I've kind of gotten away from it. So the only software I have that I use for more extensive editing, it's called GIMP, G-I-M-P, and it's an open source freebie that is clumsy to use and a little hard to learn. I don't really like it, but I don't feel like I do enough of that kind of stuff to justify paying for Photoshop or one of its equivalents.
I got it on one.
Sorry?
Like I got on one.
Mm-hmm.
Tyler, import through Mac and then into on one or just erase it on one.
There's a whole bunch of different editing programs out there that people use. And I haven't really explored the possibilities. Mostly I'm happy with just the basic raw conversions. And once in a while I get these wild hairs to go try something, to do something fancier or I don't know about more creative, but different. And then I get into some other programs, but I don't really have one that I'm comfortable with using because I haven't done it enough. Right. Well, thank you all for coming and for all those good questions.
Thank you.